Today, I'm going to talk about crime data. Crime data is a little like driving in the fog. You can see shapes, you can see movements, but if you're thinking you're seeing the full picture, you're about to get a rear ended reality. How do we know how much crime is happening in the United States? Well, in the US, we pretty much rely on three main sources of crime data. That's going to be official crime statistics, victimization based studies, and self report studies. Each one tells us something important and each one leaves things out. So, if you ever hear anyone say crime is up or crime is down, the correct follow up question is according to which data source? Let's start with official crime statistics. Crimes that are reported to the police and recorded by law enforcement agencies. So, for decades, the best known source was the Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR. The UCR is compiled by the FBI and it provides annual counts of crimes that are reported to the police. It also provides estimates of arrests that were made for certain types of offenses. The UCR grouped crimes into two parts, part one and part two, with part one being the so called index crimes. These were the most important crimes, according to the FBI, that most agencies dedicated resources to. But here's the big limitation of the UCR. It only provides information on reported crime. And we know from the victimization research that most crime is not reported to the police. So from the start, the UCR measures the police knowledge of crime, not actual crime. The second major limitation is the hierarchical reporting system. So with the UCR, if there are multiple crimes happening in one incident, only the most serious offense is counted. So if let's say someone broke into a home, they raped someone, and then they murdered them, and then they set the house on fire. According to what would get reported to the UCR, it would just be the most serious offense, which would be the homicide. Everything else disappears statistically. And that's not great for understanding victimization. And so, since then, we have transitioned into a more robust data collection done through the National Incident Based Reporting System, NIBRS, better data, but also new problems. NIBRS was designed to fix many of the limitations of the UCR. So instead of just counting crime, NIBRS actually collected detailed information about each incident. So where the crime happened, how entry was gained, what type of weapon was used, whether drugs or alcohol were involved, the victim offender relationship, and whether technology played a role in the crime. It's huge for victimology because it allows us to study the dynamics and characteristics of specific crimes. It also allows us to study things like intimate partner violence, stalking, sexual assault by known offenders, and it also allows us to look at repeat victimization in ways that the UCR simply could not. Even though it's a much more robust, rigorous data collection effort, NIBR still only includes reported crimes. Unlike the UCR, which generally had 95% of police departments participating in the data collection effort, NIBRS requires a transition, and most police departments are still working on that transition. So, for years, not all police departments have participated in NIBRS. Luckily, in Colorado, they've been participating since the transition started in 2013. But as of 2023, only about 79% of police departments participate in NIBRS, and that covers about 84% of the US population. And that's progress, but that also creates a major issue because we are in this transitional period where we are not really going to get great crime trends or estimates from the early 2000s to today because we've changed measurement systems. And then we also had the pandemic, and that created a lot of issues as well. So if someone shows you like a smooth trend line from like 1995 to 2025 and pretend that nothing's changed, be skeptical. That is not how data works. The next big source of data is victimization statistics. And this is important because it addresses a big limitation that comes from official data, what we call the dark figure of crime. That essentially is the degree of crime that does not come to the attention of the police. The most important source of that dark figure of crime and victimization data is going to be the National Crime Victimization Survey. Each year, the NCVS surveys about 76,000 households, and that covers about 135,000 people ages 12 and older. People are interviewed every 6 months for 3 years within this cohort model. And the NCV asks them, were you victimized in the last year? Tell me what happened, who did it? Did you report it to the police? Did you seek help? Why did you report to the police? Why did you not report to the police? How did the police treat you? What were the consequences of the victimization? And this is how we have learned that most victims do not report crime to the police. And victims are less likely to report when they know the offender. And so reporting varies dramatically by crime type. And those patterns matter for how we interpret official crime data. But the NCVS also has limitations. So, for example, it doesn't include children under 12. It also doesn't measure people in institutions like prisons. It also can't capture crimes like homicide because turns out dead people, they don't answer the phone, which is a non-trivial limitation. And it also doesn't capture crimes against businesses. And it also relies on memory and honesty. And even though they have tips and tricks in the data collection process to account for things like that, social science survey, there's always going to be limitations. The good news is that we have multiple sources of victimization data for victimization in the United States beyond the NCVS. So others focus on specific populations or specific types of harm. So, for example, we have the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which gives a ton of great nationally representative information about intimate partner violence, psychological aggression, sexual assault, and also stalking. They also have reports that break those estimates down by sexual minorities within the United States. We also have the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, which actually interviewed kids below the age of 12 about their exposure to not only violence within the home, but also violence within the community. And then we also have other types of surveys like campus climate surveys, the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, which measures everything from victimization to how often teens are vaping, using different types of drugs, eating carrots. Literally, that's a question. And then also if they're wearing their seatbelt. And so that allows us to look at national trends and victimization risk among youth. The third major source of data is going to be self-report studies. So this is where we have people take a survey on their own and self-report victimization and or offending. And so a lot of the studies that we have in terms of offending come from these self-report studies. So this is where we ask people directly about their behaviors that they may have never been caught for. Sometimes we ask about the behaviors that they have been caught for, but a lot of times we want to look at the true prevalence of offending, which is we will just ask them and allow them to report it on their own without having another person there asking them questions. And this is really helpful for, less serious offenses like drug use or underage drinking, delinquent behavior. They help us better understand these behaviors that rarely result in an arrest. But there's also problems with self-report data as well. Sometimes people exaggerate. Sometimes people don't report everything because they don't want the interviewer or person collecting the data to think that they're a bad person, even though everything can be confidential and anonymous. People may minimize what happened. People may lie about what happened. And high-risk individuals sometimes are often missing from samples. So if we're going to go into schools and ask people about their offending behavior, we may not be tapping into the people we want to be asking about since they're not going to school. They're skipping school. They're off doing the drugs and the Wii Fit. I don't know why I said that. So again, self-report data is useful, but incomplete. And so even though we have these different variety of data sources, it is really important to understand what those data sources are measuring and who they are measuring that information from, and also what those limitations are. Because there are going to be different estimates from NIBRS versus the NCVS, because one is looking at reported crime, the other is looking at all victimizations, whether or not they are reported to the police. So now I want to talk about what crime actually looks like in the United States. So let's talk trends. First, public perceptions. Public perceptions of crime are based off the news for the most part, and also personal experiences, but for the most part, it's the news. And public perceptions of crime are far more dramatic than what the data show. A lot of times you're going to hear crime is out of control at the national level, but when we actually look at the data, it generally doesn't support that claim. In fact, it really hasn't supported that claim since 1993. Well, a little bit during the pandemic, because we did see some rise in violent crime there, understandably. But for the most part, violent crime has been continuing to decline since the pandemic. In fact, it's been on a steady downward trend since 1993. So violent crime in 2025, significantly lower than pre-pandemic levels. Homicides declined substantially from 2019 to 2025. So did aggravated assault, sexual assault, domestic violence, robbery, and even carjackings. In fact, both violent and property crime have declined by roughly 50% since 1993. So that doesn't mean that crime doesn't exist. It means that crime fluctuates, and panic is not data. And so whenever you hear about crime trends increasing, ask your local criminologist or use the tools and tricks that you are learning in this class to get a better understanding of where to find accurate information about crime data. Remember that crime rates are going to vary by the data source. So to understand the true level of crime, we need estimates from people who did and did not report their experience to the police. So based on victimization data, about half of violent crime victims reported to the police, and about one third of property victims did the same. Over half of violent crime and about 70% of property crime never come to the attention of the police, which is why NIBRS can be a good source of data, but it is also missing 70% of property crimes that happen in the United States. You don't even want to know about clearance rates, but I'll tell you anyway because I'm a what? Scientist. Okay, so in 2025, about 48% of violent crimes were cleared by an arrest. That means that they were solved. For property crimes, that was about 18%. So about 1 in 5 reports, property crimes that are reported to the police are actually cleared by an arrest. So besides rape, we see higher clearance rates for homicide, aggravated assault, and robbery at the national level. Still, it is wild to think that roughly 65% of robberies didn't result in an arrest. And that matters for victim expectations and trust in the system. Looking specifically at Colorado compared to the United States, it largely mirrors national property crime patterns. Where Colorado actually stands out, though, is look at homicide. You better not be killing people in Colorado. They're going to find you and they're going to arrest you. Colorado homicide clearance rate much higher than the national average. However, not so much with other crimes, especially rape and aggravated assault. Those tend to not seem like they are getting cleared by arrest in 2025 as much. However, remember that this is only 1 year of data. So we would need to look at clearance rates and trends over time. We need to be able to compare multiple years of data because, much like the pandemic, estimates are going to be completely different in 2019 versus 2020 and then 2021 and 2022. So now that we're getting out of the pandemic, we're starting to get more consistent information about crime. But at the same time, not every police department is participating in the national level in terms of crime rates. So in sum, here's the big picture. There's not a single number that tells us how much crime is happening. Official statistics tell us what the police know, whereas victimization surveys tell us what victims experience and whether they reported to the police and or sought other types of help-seeking behaviors. Self-report studies can come in clutch, and they tell us what people are doing, but pretty much only what they admit to doing. So each source has different answers because they ask different questions. So the goal is not to pick a favorite. The goal is to understand what each source can and cannot tell us, and to be cautious when crime data are used to make dramatic claims. Because in criminology and victimology, how we measure something shapes what we think is happening. And that shapes policy, practice, and also public fear.